I was on a road trip last year and decided to spend one night at a place I found on Airbnb. It was a cabin in the woods, located halfway along my journey. I only planned to stay for a night before continuing my drive. I got there just before dusk. The road leading to the cabin was a long gravel path, which I followed for a few minutes before finally reaching the cabin. It appeared older than I anticipated, and the path from the driveway to the front door was a muddy dirt trail, likely due to recent rain. Once I dragged my bags inside, I took a moment to look around. The cabin was very dim, with few windows, and despite the sun being partially up, it was still pretty dark inside. I flipped on one light in the corner of the room, but it was the only one that worked. I sent a quick text to the host, asking if I had missed a power switch or something, but by that point, I was already frustrated. It was only for one night, though, so I tried not to stress too much. I set my things in the bedroom, then went out to sit in one of the chairs in the living room. The furniture was old and outdated, but the place was still comfortable. I pulled out my phone to start planning the second part of my drive the next day. Then, suddenly, there was a loud knock on the front door. The knock startled me, and honestly, it irritated me. I had no idea who it could be. There was no peephole or anything to see through, so I just opened the door. A man stood there, dressed in a thick winter coat, smiling widely. It wasn't too cold outside, and a snow jacket definitely wasn't necessary, but he had one on. He introduced himself as the host and said he was there to help me with the lights. I wasn't thrilled that he'd shown up unannounced, especially since the lights weren't a big deal to me. But he was already there, so I let him in to help. He walked straight into the living room, went up to a lamp, and started fiddling with it. While he was working, I glanced out the window toward the driveway. Strangely, I didn't see any other cars. The cabin was far out in the woods, so there was no way he could have arrived here so fast after I sent the text. I turned to ask him about it, but he was already looking at me. We locked eyes for a brief moment, and then he smiled and apologized, saying he couldn't figure out what was wrong with the light. I told him not to worry about it, since I needed to get to bed soon, and moved aside to let him leave. He exited the cabin slowly, without saying anything else. The whole thing felt off, and I couldn't shake the thought of how he could have gotten here so quickly without a car. I decided to watch him for a bit. He walked down the gravel driveway, as though he was going to keep walking, but then he stopped and turned around. I stayed out of sight, hoping he wouldn't notice me. He just stood there, staring at the cabin, before walking off the gravel path and heading into the woods. I wasn't sure what to make of it all, but seeing the man dressed as though he lived outdoors and then walking into the forest gave me an uneasy feeling. I stayed up for about 20 minutes, checking the windows every so often. Just before I was about to get ready for bed, there was another loud knock at the door. This time, I was sure it was the same man, but it was way too dark outside for anyone else to be coming by. The knock was forceful, and I didn't know what to do, so I stayed quiet. After a minute, I heard footsteps moving around to the side of the cabin. I quietly went to the bedroom, shining my phone's light so I could see. I listened to the footsteps until they stopped right by the window. There was a brief moment of silence. I kept my light focused on the window, waiting to see if they would come into view. Then, the footsteps started again, retreating as the person walked away. I listened until the sounds faded, then quickly grabbed my things and rushed out to my car. I drove 6 miles to the nearest gas station and immediately called the police. I didn't know what was happening, but I figured it was better to be cautious than to regret it. The police got in touch with the Airbnb host, and to my shock, it was someone completely different from the man who had visited me. They couldn't explain who the other man was or why he'd been there, which only made things more terrifying. After the police investigation was finished, I continued my road trip the next morning. But as I drove, one question kept nagging at me. How did the man know the lights weren't working if he wasn't the host I had texted? Maybe he had broken the lamps himself before I arrived, to make me trust him, or maybe he was working with the host in some way. I'll never know what their plan was, but I'm pretty sure I wouldn't have made it out of there if I had stayed the night. Last year, I spent some time at a cabin that my family has owned for many years. It's a modest two-bedroom place, situated in a very remote area. Over the years, our family has used it as a place to escape, whether for a vacation or a weekend retreat. I had never been too keen on staying there because it only had well water that had to be pumped manually, and the bathroom was an outhouse located across the yard. The only reason I decided to stay there this time was that I needed a quiet place to get away for a few days, but I didn't have enough money to rent a cabin elsewhere. When I arrived, I was really struck by how isolated it was. I knew it was going to be far out, but this cabin felt completely off the grid. I parked on the side of the road, fired up the generator for power, and used the family's key to get inside. It wasn't too bad, and given that it was free, I didn't have any complaints. I settled in, checked everything to make sure the cabin was in good shape, and made myself a cup of tea. After that, I sat by the fireplace with my laptop. There was no cell service out there, but I had some relaxing tasks I could work on without needing the internet. I lost track of time, but after a few hours, when the sun had set, I packed up my things and decided to head to bed. I stepped outside to turn off the generator so I wouldn't waste fuel, and that's when I noticed something odd. Out in the woods, I could see a light. It was striking because it was the only light visible for miles around. I watched it move through the trees, and it eventually faded out of sight. I stayed outside for a few more minutes to make sure it had really gone, then headed back inside. Being so far from any other people, it was unsettling to think someone could be so close. I put out the fire, grabbed a battery-powered lamp, and made my way to the bedroom. I climbed into bed and fell asleep. The next morning, I woke up at dawn, made some coffee, and stayed inside the cabin until midday. Then I went for a walk. I was curious about the light I'd seen the night before, so I decided to head in the direction it had been. After about 20 minutes of walking, I reached the area where I thought the light had been. There was no sign of a path or anyone having been there. I looked around for a bit, then returned to the cabin and went about my day. I got the fire going again and followed my usual routine. When night came, I headed outside to turn off the generator, and again I saw the light. It was in the same spot, but this time it wasn't moving. It just stayed there, glowing in the distance. I watched it for a while, but it never flickered or shifted, so I went back inside. Within an hour, I was in bed, trying to get some rest. In the middle of the night, I woke up. I was groggy and tired, but I really needed to use the bathroom. I lay there for as long as I could, hoping the feeling would pass, but it didn't. I put on some clothes, grabbed a small lamp, and went outside to the outhouse. After I finished, on the way back to the cabin, I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the dirt, right in front of one of the windows. I stared at them for a while, sure they weren't mine. Then I saw that the prints led around the cabin and eventually disappeared. I wasn't planning to follow them, but when I looked at the direction they were heading, it seemed to match up perfectly with where I had seen the lights earlier in the woods. But now the light was gone. A chill ran down my spine, and I quickly ran back to the cabin. I grabbed my bag, jumped in my car, and drove away into the night, not daring to look back. I'll probably never know exactly what happened that night, but I don't think I want to find out. I went on a hike during a trip I took last spring. One of my earlier plans for that day had fallen through, so heading out on the trail was a last-minute backup idea. The area I was in wasn't really known for beautiful nature or anything. Mostly flat land with forests surrounding it, but I didn't have anything else to do, so I went anyway. Something that stood out to me was how along the path I kept seeing narrow trails splitting off from the main route. They all looked small and barely used, like a handful of people might have gone through them just trying to find a shortcut. But one path in particular caught my eye. It led off in a totally different direction from the main trail, and just by the way everything looked around it, I couldn't figure out why anyone would have gone that way. I tried to look around a bit to see where it led, but the trees were thick and blocked my view. My curiosity got the better of me and I decided to follow it, just to see where it ended up. I figured it might take me to a creek or maybe a clearing or something interesting, but really, anything was more appealing than the trail I had been on. I walked for about 15 minutes, longer than I thought I would, before the path just sort of disappeared. It faded into open ground with only grass and trees ahead. I took a few more steps beyond where the trail ended, and that's when I noticed something a short distance away. There was a small cabin sitting alone in the woods. The outside was covered in green moss, and the roof looked like it could collapse at any second. I walked up to it and saw that the door was missing. The trees overhead blocked out most of the daylight, so it was pretty dim inside. I moved a little closer and stopped just at the doorway. It was hard to see much, but I could make out broken furniture and random pieces of wood scattered across the floor. I lifted my phone to use the flashlight and stepped further in. There were 2 rooms, mostly empty besides all the broken stuff, but there was one door in the middle of a short hallway that was halfway open. When I looked in, I saw a stairway leading down, maybe 10 or 12 steps, to what looked like a basement. It definitely gave off a creepy feeling, like something you'd see in a scary movie. But since the whole place looked like nobody had been in it for years, I didn't feel like I was in any real danger. I went down the stairs and immediately got hit with a horrible smell, like something was rotting or it was filled with rats. I held my phone up to shine light into the space and saw that it wasn't very big, about the size of a small storage room made of old, rotting wood. On the far wall was another door, cracked slightly open. My phone light barely reached through the gap, but I could tell it opened into a narrow tunnel of some kind. I was too nervous to walk in, so I just stayed on the stairs and looked. From where I stood, I could only see a few feet into it. The tunnel didn't look like it was built well. It was falling apart in some places, and anything beyond the entrance was swallowed in darkness. I started feeling more and more uneasy, and that's when I decided I'd seen enough. I turned to go back up, but as I moved the light across the room, a pair of eyes lit up in the corner, right underneath the stairs. I panicked and bolted up the steps, tripping a little as fear completely overtook me. I didn't stop running until I was outside the cabin and back on the main path. I kept going straight to my car and didn't stop until I was driving out of the woods. I still don't know who or what I saw in that basement, but the memory of those glowing eyes just a few feet away in that dark room still haunts me when I try to sleep.